Morning. Let me begin by thanking 𝗙𝗵𝗵 Vaishnav College for Women and the Bharat Center for Reform and Public Policy for inviting me here today. I was here about 3 years odd back and I had a great interaction. So it is good to be back here again. Thank you for inviting me. Since today's topic is, associated with an institution that talks about reforms in public policy, I thought this would be an appropriate presentation about how is economic policy reforms actually done. Because you all read in newspapers that so-and-so reform got done, this got done, that got done. So it may seem like some sort of a great mysterious thing that people sitting in government buildings are doing. But hopefully I will be able to convince you at the end of it that we reformers are not as crazy as some of you think, and that there is some thought process that goes into many of the reforms that we are attempting to do. So there's lots of different types of reforms. I'm going to stick with a type of reform called process reforms. These are economic reforms of a particular type. So I need to quickly tell you what on earth these process reforms are. You see, when you hear about reforms, mostly what you hear about is about structural reforms. So you'll read in newspapers, so-and-so structural reform happened. Now, structural reforms are really the very big reforms that happen from time to time. These are called structural because they change the structure of whatever it is that they are trying to reform. So, for example, the GST reform is a structural reform. It's changed the fundamental structure in which indirect taxes were collected in this country. Similarly, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code is a change in the structure of how creative destruction and liquidation happened in this country. The original 1991 reforms, they were a structural reform because they got rid of the license permit Raj, old system, introduced a more market-based system. That is a structural reform because that is changed the structure of how our economy was arranged. Now obviously these are very big reforms, but they can only happen once in a while. If I keep doing structural reforms all the time, you will get very exhausted. So most of the reforms that reformers actually do are much more nuts and bolts reforms. They are somewhat more boring, of course. So very often you won't have it on the front pages of newspapers. If they are reported at all, they will be there in the 5th page, one column. Very often only people in that little sector care about it. But in fact, the bulk of reforms that happen are this. And they're happening continuously. You may not realize this, but they're happening. Small reforms are happening all the time. These are nuts and bolts reforms. Some regulation, rule number 43B, subsection D, 3 words will be changed for some reason. This is what actually is most of reforms. So while some of you may have a sense of the grand debates in Parliament about some big reform that comes in the newspapers, the real act of doing most of the reforms is actually about doing nuts and bolts reforms. Even the big structural reforms only work because along the way you keep making these small adjustments. So for example, you can have GST, big reform, but in order to actually function, we have to make all these small reforms. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these reforms because very often you don't get a flavor of this, whereas in fact, for us reformers, this is what is really our bread and butter. We do the big reforms, but this is what we do most of the time. Now, oddly enough, if any of you ever go on to study in a management school, you will learn about something called business process re-engineering. Now, oddly enough, you don't hear very much about government process re-engineering. But in fact, most of the pain points that you have with dealing with the state, get yourself some card, passport, etc. All of the processes that lead to that service being delivered to you is mostly related to this. So bear with me if I give you a little bit of theory and then I will illustrate all of this for you going forward. Now, if you want to do these kinds of reforms, one is to go out there and do those reforms, each department at a time. Now, the problem is that this makes it, unfortunately, that each time you're reinventing the wheel. So there's actually some method to the madness. And to do this, there is a simple schema that I'm going to do. Just remember it. I will come back to it. The first is obviously to identify something that you think is inefficient. It's inefficient because it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of money, whatever it is you think why it needs a reform. Then you have to do something called documentation of the as-is process. Now this is a very important thing. This is the step where you basically lay out whatever that process it is that you are trying to reform, simply lay it out as it exists today. So for example, if you're doing institutional reform, you can lay out the architecture of the institutions that you want to look at. Or if it's a process, you literally go step by step and see how it works today. Very often, this is a real problem in the government because there will be people who have worked in that sector for a long time and they assume that they actually know how the process works. But now that I've done hundreds of these reforms, one of the things I've noticed is that even somebody who's worked in a sector for as much as 10 years may sometimes not understand the entire process. In fact, this is the source of the problem. Because large systems, not just the bureaucracy, but any large system, they'll even be perhaps true of your university. Everybody is in a little box. They don't actually understand what happens before them and after them. So as is, process mapping is very, very important. Then comes the next interesting stuff. Now that you've worked out the process, you begin to identify here exactly what the issue is. Now, why is this an important thing? You see, and I will talk to you a little bit about the 80-20 rule. Most of the time, 80% of the problem, sometimes 90% of the problem is due to 20 to 10% of the process. Why is this an important and useful insight? Because it basically means that in order to get the system going, you don't need to do complicated and disruptive structural reforms. Most of the time, you can actually make the system work by just changing 10 to 20% of the system. That is why process reforms are so powerful. You actually manage to do most of the change with very little effort. Too many times everybody wants a clean slate and wants to do something completely new. But in fact, you are dealing with a running system. It's like trying to fix a car while you are still driving it. And if you try to change the whole car, you won't be able to do it. So this is why it's important, the 80-20 rule. Then obviously the next step is to actually do the changes, that whatever it is you identified. And then comes the very last part of the process, which is to monitor whether or not whatever change you wanted to achieve through the reform has actually happened, feedback loop, and very important in government, whether or not you've had an unintended consequence. Now, much of this, by the way, can be done also in companies or any large systems. Most of these same rules will apply, but in the specific case of governments, the feedback loop and unintended consequences are very, very important, because governments are very often difficult places for taking feedback. There are many reasons for this. Sometimes it's because of political pressures, but there is one very simple human reason why this happens. Reforms take time, civil servants get shuffled. The person who did the change may have moved on, the next person simply does not know what has happened. So there are many reasons why this doesn't happen. Similarly, you make a change here, you achieve the ends, but somewhere else in the system something unintended happens as a result. Now in a company, in a small system, it's more easy to figure this out. But in a large system, this is a very big important thing. I'll give you one example. We have over the last decade dramatically introduced solar power generation. Now you may see that this is a good thing, and yes, it is a good thing because solar power is a good thing and it doesn't create CO2, etc. But you know what has happened as a result? The problem is now our grids have all become unstable. Why? Because during the daylight hours, lots of electricity is produced. But in the evening, when all of you will go home and switch on your air conditioning, lights, etc., there is a massive spike in electricity usage in exactly the same time that the solar power actually switches off because the sun goes down. So, although we are now producing lots and lots more excess energy, just when you need it, you don't get it. So, you now have to invest heavily into storage and other things as well. But meanwhile, what is happening is that at midday, there are many days in which you will be surprised to hear that the national grid actually refuses to take power. We have so much excess power. It's almost free. You'll get a unit of power at 1 rupee or something like that. And then in the same day, in the evening, it will spike up to over 10 rupees. In fact, there's a limit at 10 rupees, so it doesn't go over. But if we had an open system, it would probably go to 12, 13 rupees. So imagine, a 13 times increase spike in energy prices in the same day. So, we'll fix it, of course, but I'm just pointing out to you how unintended consequences happen. Okay. Now, here is, just so that you know this, the importance of process mapping, and I'm talking about this a little more. Because I'm going to give you examples of others, just bear with me. But one of the reasons this is very important is that you see, whenever governments are under pressure to improve some system, what do? They'll tell you, oh, we are digitizing this system. Now, if you digitize the existing system, sometimes you get some benefit, but in fact, a lot of the time, the old system being digitized does not really improve anything. Because the old system was designed from a pre-digital system. Now you have digitized it. Not much benefit. In fact, sometimes, as I will show you shortly, it may actually worsen the situation. So when you do a change, please map out the process before you do a basic change, because otherwise you may actually not get all the benefits. So this is very important. Oops, some reason it's got stuck. If you can flick to the next slide, please. Yeah. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the different kinds. You don't have to memorize this, but these are the kinds of reforms you have. I will give you some illustrations. I have identified 7 types. There might be an 8th type. If you find one, I'll add it here. But here are the kinds of process reforms we usually deal with. The first and most obvious kinds and simplest kinds of process reforms is to revisit lists and precedents that are defaults of any system. So any large system, you can write down all the rules. Even this college, the way it actually functions is because of all the informal rules, precedents, etc. that are the defaults of how human behavior and interaction happens. This is not written down anywhere. It is just how it happens. It has evolved there. Somebody somewhere along the way may have changed it and devised it, but you end up with this kind of a system. So you will end up with these lists. Nobody knows why these lists or precedents exist, but they do. But they heavily influence the way any large system works. I'll give you an example. When I was in finance ministry, every year we used to invite, and they still do, a group of experts from different fields. They may come from industry, from civil society, from different parts of aspects of the economy. They come and meet the finance minister and they give suggestions. Nothing wrong with that. And when I was principal economic advisor, it was my job to call these people and invite them. So in different days, you will see this will happen even this year. You will see. So what happens in these is that you inherit a list of people who were called over the last few years. So when I looked at this list and went through it, There were, of course, well-known people who are invited from different aspects of Indian society. But it was quite interesting that that list had not been revised for a very long time. So many members of that list were no longer even alive, and yet that list had not been revised. And many prominent people who had emerged in recent years had not got added to it. So something as simple as that doesn't get done. And by the way, the same thing happens even with something as important as your list of national monuments. Okay, so you have a list of nationally protected monuments under AMSAR. India, by the way, has some 3,650 odd national monuments. Now the question is, where did we end up with this list? How did we get this list? Why are there these 3,600 odd monuments and not some other list? It turns out, when I looked at it, this is in 2002 or so, it turns out that some 2/3 of this was simply inherited from the British in 1947. They had a list of nationally protected monuments which I had in colonial period, we got them. And most of the other 1/3 was inherited from the princely states. So effectively the entire list was basically made up of some monuments which we inherited from the colonial period. Now few more monuments were added along the way, but no monument was removed. So when in 2022 I looked at this list, I discovered something quite interesting. First of all, there were several dozen monuments that had gone missing. The Archaeological Survey of India had no idea where these monuments actually were. So much so that they had given a reply in Parliament that they did not where it was. So that was the first point, and they were still there in the national monument list. Next, the list was full of colonial era monuments that were clearly not of national importance, which included loads of graves of obscure colonial era officials like PWD engineers and so on. So I'm not talking about, Victoria Memorial or Kolkata or something, which may be a big thing. At least it's aesthetically good looking, something important. So I'm okay with preserving that. I'm talking about small graves, smaller than this stage, in places like Nagaland. In fact, in Nagaland, there are 4 national monuments. 3 of them are graves of obscure officials who nobody knows who they are. They were killed about 100 odd years ago by local tribesmen for some dispute or the other. One would think that maybe one could have monuments to those tribesmen because one could perhaps call them freedom fighters, I don't know. But certainly no case for preserving these small graves where, incidentally, all the rules and regulations that apply to the Taj Mahal also apply to them. Because there's the same set of rules for national monuments. So the same rules that apply to the Taj Mahal apply to these tiny graves in the middle of nowhere, which includes, by the way, a 100 plus 200 meter radius where there is severely regulated. So you have to actually, if you want to make changes even inside your house, you have to go to the Archaeological Survey of India and, make a petition, potentially encourage them in other ways in order to get your permission. So like this, I found many other places even in the city of Delhi. So let me tell you one story about the statue of John Nicholson. Now, how many of you even know who John Nicholson is? Does anybody here know who John Nicholson is? Literally nobody. So let me tell you who he is. So you'll all know that there was a great revolt in 1857-58. Yeah? Now during one of the places that big revolt happened was the walled city, the old city of Delhi, Shahjahanabad. Now in 1858, after the revolt, the city was taken back by the British and sacked. And the British Brigadier General who did it was John Nicholson. Now, John Nicholson was cruel even by the standards of his time. He basically took back the city and he carried out a massive massacre, not just of the rebels, but even of general civilian population. And even at that time, people thought that he was a bit excessive. Anyway, he was a hero to the British. And so in time, they raised a statue to John Nicholson in front of Kashmiri Gate. So Kashmiri Gate, those of you who've been to Delhi, is one of the gates of the old city of Delhi. So now, we became independent in 1947. So, as I told you, the list became a part of the list of national monuments. This included the statue of John Nicholson in front of Kashmiri Gate. Now, nobody bothered to remove it. Till in 1958, John Nicholson's hometown in Northern Ireland wrote a letter to the government of India saying that presumably you no longer have use for this statue. Can you give it to us? Because we will celebrate John Nicholson. So the government of the time took down the statue, wrapped it in bubble wrap, I assume, and sent it off to Northern Ireland, where in the middle of his hometown it's been put up, and I assume every year they commemorate him or whatever. So the John Nicholson statue is now in Northern Ireland. There's only one problem. The problem is that the statue was not delisted from the list of national monuments. So therefore, the empty spot on which it used to stand continued to be a national monument. And the 300-meter radius around it in Kashmiri Gate, which is one of the most densely populated places in Delhi, continued to be regulated by the Archaeological Survey of India. And if you happen to have a house there, you had to go to Archaeological Survey of India, get harassed for months, if not years, perhaps have to pay a small bribe to the local official to get permission to even make small changes to your house. Why? Because you are in the 300-meter radius of a national monument. So finally, when I wrote about this in the newspaper and mocked the officials, they delisted it. So in December 2024, the statue of John Nicholson was finally delisted from the list of national monuments. But his grave, which is just half a kilometer away, is still a national monument. So I am now working on that one. Now that is just type 1. I can give you examples like this of the others. Type 2, which I will come to, administrative streamlining. Here there is an administrative process and you need to change that process in some fashion. Then you have to change the rules and regulations. So under a given law, the department has certain rules and regulations. So sometimes you have to change those rules and regulations. Then sometimes you have to go back to Parliament. So this is where very often the very big changes happen, but sometimes amendments happen which are also process reforms and small changes. So those are legislative changes. Sometimes you have to add capacity in the government. So for example, just like in a pipeline or in a highway, you can have a lot of width in the capacity and then at one point it is narrow and then widens out again. Now the entire capacity of the pipeline is ultimately just the narrowest point, right? So sometimes you have to widen out that narrowest point. So type 5 is adding state capacity at some choke point. Sometimes it is about removing state and state-enabled monopoly. So sometimes you add capacity, sometimes you have to remove it. So for example, you may be surprised to know that till the year 2020, Google Maps was actually technically illegal in India. So all of you were using Google Maps, all were doing something illegal. Because maps in India was the monopoly of a body called the Survey of India. It's only in 2020 that finally we managed to get rid of that monopoly. But sometimes those state monopolies are given to other parties which are outside of government, which are given certain powers. For example, professional bodies. You were mentioning, sir, the Chartered Accountants Institute. That's a professional body. It's not a part of the government, but it is given certain monopoly, and that monopoly can sometimes be misused. And I'll give you one example of it. I have been in recent years trying to advocate that we need to have larger Indian chartered accountancy, but also consultancy bodies from of Indian origin, rather than this big four domination that you have everywhere. Now there are many reasons for this. One of the major reasons, ironically, is that our own Chartered Accountants Institute actually introduces rules that makes it impossible for Indian consultancies, chartered accountancies, etc. to create brands for themselves. So I have been to many conferences where right behind me it will say Ernst & Young has sponsored it, Deloitte, whatever, PwC, etc. But I have almost never been to one in which our own companies have sponsored it. Now, is this because we don't have any firm at all who can build a brand? Actually, that is not the case. The reason they cannot do it is because our own chartered accountancy rules used to state, and I think that's now being changed, that you could not do any form of advertising or brand building. So much so that you could not actually write your name of your firm in anything more than font size 14, right? Now just imagine how ridiculous it is. Font size 14. So I have had absurd situations where I have gone to an event where there is a very eminent chartered accountant sitting next to me, and his name is there, and his name of his firm is written in very small font, ridiculously small, nobody in the audience can read it. He said, "Sir, if I do it, I will get in trouble in the Chartered Accountants Institute." So this is how we shoot ourselves in the foot. And then of course there is the rationalization of institutional architecture of government. So any large system will over time accumulate all kinds of old bodies. Some of them may have made sense, but over time they have become outdated and irrelevant. You need to close them, you need to transfer them and merge them with something. You have to do something about it. This is again, as I said, not only true of government, it's true of any large organization. It will be true of universities, it will be true of large companies and so on. This kind of situation happens all the time, and we need to begin to clean them up. Now what I'm going to do is give you some examples of this, so that in detail. Now this is about voluntary liquidation of companies. So it's ridiculously small, nobody in the audience can read it. He said, "Sir, if I do it, I will get in trouble in the Chartered Accountants Institute." So this is how we shoot ourselves in the foot. And then of course there is the rationalization of institutional architecture of government. So any large system will over time accumulate all kinds of old bodies. Some of them may have made sense, but over time they have become outdated and irrelevant. You need to close them, you need to transfer them and merge them with something. You have to do something about it. This is again, as I said, not only true of government, it's true of any large organization. It will be true of universities, it will be true of large companies and so on. This kind of situation happens all the time, and we need to begin to clean them up. Now what I'm going to do is give you some examples of this, so that in detail. Now this is about voluntary liquidation of companies. So every year in any country there are new companies that come and old companies that are written off. Yeah, they go out. Now some small part of them happen because they went bankrupt or insolvent or something, and so some bad thing happened to them, they had to be shut down. But in any country, something like 80-90% of the companies that shut down in any year happen purely because of voluntary reasons. So for example, some businessman was running a small company, he's now become old, his kids are not interested in running that company, so he decides to shut it down. Common phenomenon. Similarly, a special purpose vehicle is created by a company for some purpose. That purpose has now been completed, you want to shut it down. Now there is nobody objecting to the actual shutting down of this company. And yet, in India, shutting down a company was a very, very difficult task till just a few years ago. Has anyone here in front, particularly you have lots of people from business, have you any of you attempted to shut down a company voluntarily in this country? Yeah, here are some people here. So you will know how painful it used to be. It used to take years to shut down a company, even though everybody agrees that it should be shut down, nobody is objecting to it, and yet it would take years. And remember, keeping a company going is not a fun thing. You still have to give its audits, annual, this thing, do meetings, all kinds. So as long as it is alive, it's a living being and you have to. So, some years ago I began to look into this. So as I said, there are two methods of shutting down companies in India. The main method of doing this is through something called Section 248(2) of the Companies Act 2013. Students, I'm sorry, but most of life is about dragging out such detail. Okay, so Section 248(2) of the Companies Act 2013 is most companies that are shut down are under this. There is also a provision under IBC that is meant for large companies, but bulk of companies are shut down through this. Now, as I said, these are companies with no pending litigations, everything has been extinguished, its assets, everything is done. And yet, when I began to look into this some years ago in 2021-22, I discovered that there were 28,536 pending cases. Nearly 10% of them had been pending for more than 1,000 days. And 54% were pending for more than 1 year. So companies were languishing for years and not being able to shut down, even though everybody agreed it had to shut down. Nobody was disagreeing with it. So on average, roughly speaking, about 500 days it took to shut down a company in this country. Okay? This is average. As I said, there were some running for more than 1,000 days. So what did we do? I told you, as is mapping. So we began to map it out. So how do you shut down a company under this act? Well, first thing you have to do is convene a meeting. The board meeting will then approve the closure of bank accounts, pay off the pending liabilities and so on. All standard stuff. Then the company was supposed to file something called an STK2 form with respect to the registrar of companies with whatever fees had to be paid. Then third, the directors had to furnish a declaration in electronic form stating that the company does not have any dues towards any government department. This was certified by a chartered accountant, cost accountant, company secretary and so on. And then the STK form began to be accompanied by a copy of the resolution, and you basically now put it in. So now, after doing all of this, the counter starts. So all of this has been done. Now the counter starts. You send it to the Registrar of Companies in the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. The Registrar of Companies' job is essentially to do the following thing: to put up an advertisement in the official website of the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, in the official gazette, and also to put up just the name of the company in a newspaper, one in English and one in any Indian language paper, stating that this company is shutting down. So in case there was somebody who had some dues from that company, they can come and raise some objection. Okay? This was how it was done, and then after some time, the idea was, if nobody came up with an objection, the company was be wound down. This is the process. Now, what really used to happen is that the companies, of course, do their own meetings, board, etc., done quickly. They filled out the form, they sent it. Now, all that the registrar of company has to do is to actually simply put out an advertisement saying that this company wants to shut down. This used to take years. The simple act of putting out the advertisement. Why? Well, there were in none of the rules there was any strict timelines for the ROC to follow. They would keep randomly asking for all kinds of documents. There was no standard format. And as we found out, what they would do is there was a standard rate that you basically had to pay some broker, in order to actually get your work done. I, in fact, managed to find the rate card for getting this done. And of course, the ROCs would also ask for external departments like income tax department to give you all kinds of NOCs. So all of this took all this time, whereas in fact it should take no time at all. So what did we do? So what we did is we created something called CPACE, which is Centralized Processing for Accelerated Corporate Exit. So basically what happened is we created a website and we broke down the old system completely. So what you do is, supposing I am a company who wants to shut down, take all your paperwork, put it into the system. Now the system automatically sends out emails to relevant departments asking them, do you have a no objection to this? If they don't get back up within a specified time, the system generates a list on its own and gives it to the ROC to put up as advertisement. Now at this stage, the ROC can object, but in fact they have to do it in writing. So if they say so and so company shouldn't shut down, they should give in writing why this company cannot be shut down. And of course what happens is nobody wants to give anything in writing. So net result, what has happened is that the entire list is now going into the advertisement. Within 30 days the thing comes out and these companies are being shut down. It may sound like an utterly boring thing to do, but look at the dramatic impact. What used to take on average almost 500 days now takes only 60 days. This is ease of doing business. This is an 88% reduction in the time in the ease of exit. Okay? That's why I told you, process reforms are painful. They have to document, you have to go into the details. There'll be usually the existing people who are running it, who are benefiting from the current system, will always oppose you. But if you persist, you get these very dramatic changes that you can make. And this is a good application of what I said was the 80-20 rule. I didn't have to change everything. I didn't change any law mortis. I didn't even change the regulations. I just changed the administrative process. Now, this can also be done for other forms of exit. I told you there was another way of shutting down a company through IBC. This is only used by very, very big companies. Again here, this used to take for ages. So for example, in December 2021, there were 115 cases had been filed. Out of the total, final reports had been received for 49% of the cases, but the final order of dissolution had only been passed for 25% of the cases. So 75% of the cases were languishing. And of the ongoing cases, 35 had been running for more than 2 years and 18% had been running for 1 to 2 years. So look at how much delays are generally happening for no reason at all. Again, we did an as-is mapping. And what did we discover? We discovered that most of the delay, if you used this IBC approach to shutting down a company, happened because you had to go and get all manner of no objection certificates from tax department, labor department, and so on. Now the bizarre thing was that in fact the law did not even require you to get the NOCs. It was not required. And yet the officials who ran the system insisted on it. So what did we have to do? There were many other things as well. But because there were delays in getting the NOCs and there was no standard format, every NCLT court came up with its own format about how to do this. So what did we do? We standardized it. First of all, the Insolvency Board of India, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India, in November 2020 actually came up with a clarification which stated, it is hereby clarified that the provisions of the code and regulations of section 178 of Income Tax Act 1971 and insolvency professionals handling voluntary liquidations, it is not required to seek any NOC from Income Tax Department for compliance of the said process. So you actually had to write it out that you don't need it. Now in most countries, if you didn't write it out, you wouldn't ask for it. We have the opposite problem here. If you don't write it out, they will ask you for it. So we clarified clearly, you don't need it. Then what we did, we created something called Form H. You probably have to use it, sir. this is the thing. It's a standard format. You just tick your way down it. Once you have ticked all the boxes, it is said that the process is complete. Nobody, no official can ask you for, oh, but you forgot to do something. No. Once it's complete, it's complete. And again, look at the impact. Dramatic improvement in the percentage of cases under voluntary liquidation. It used to be, 44% final report had been submitted, now 78%. Earlier 22% had been closed, now 59%. Dramatic speeding up of the process. It's not ideal still, I think it can still be improved, but you can see how these small changes, somebody goes in there, finds out what it is that is clogging the system and changes it. That is what the boring business of doing reforms really looks like. But it is important. This is what makes the system efficient, and in not too much time from now, those sitting in the back rows, I'm sorry to tell you, if you want to get into policy making, you have to be ready to do these kinds of things. So please learn this, very, very important. Now I'm going to give you another example of a different kind of process reform. This relates to something called the Investor Education and Protection Fund. Now, how many in this audience even know what it is? Okay, a small number of, at least in the front, there are about 6-7 people who know what it is. Just so that you know, this is where basically unclaimed shares go to die. So supposing your grandaunt suddenly left you 50 crores of shares of some successful company, and you're feeling very happy about this, then let me tell you that first of all, the shares will first go to this fund, and then it is your problem to get it out of this fund. Only then you can celebrate. And the chances are, till we did these reforms recently, the chances were that you would probably meet your grandaunt in the afterlife before you got the money. In fact, most people, the official numbers said it took 3 years to get the money out, but in fact, the bulk of the people simply gave up. So when I began to look into this issue in late 2024, early 25, I discovered that if you included the dividends accrued, etc., almost 1 lakh crore of money was stuck in this fund. Okay, there were the money belonging to citizens. The fund was created, in fact, to give the money back. But in fact, taking out money out of this fund was very difficult. Those of you who have tried it will remember this. In fact, effectively, you had to go and bribe some broker with 20% of the value, and they would find some way of taking out the money. This was what was going on when we began to look into this issue. Again, what is the first step? Map the process. And what did we discover? That in order to get your money back, you had to actually do 25 separate steps. And these separate 25 steps were not even in one place. They were spread over 3 different portals. So first you had to put it into one portal to ask for permission to get the money. Then once you got the permission and approvals, you had to go to a second portal to actually get your shares back. And then when you got the shares back, you had to go to a third portal in order to get your dividends back. These portals did not talk to each other. And if in the process of doing this, if there was a mistake, in the 24th step, you have to go back to step number 1, which tells you that snakes and ladders in an Indian game. Now, I have long thought that maybe 𝗵𝗔 College can try and find out who designed this process and nominate them for next year's Economics Nobel Prize. Now, do you really want me to read you all the 25 steps? There are 25 steps. Okay, let me just at least show you. These are the steps, those you care. For the first website, approval process. You can see this is all very painful stuff. More of the steps to step 13. Then transfer of shares from step 14 onwards goes down. Then for dividend transfer all the way to step 25. If you wanted to get your entire money back, this is the how much effort you had to put in. And as I told you, make a mistake, go back to the beginning. So, as you can see, we mapped out the entire process. Having mapped it out, well, it was obvious what we needed to do. Among the many things that we discovered was the first obvious thing. They were on 3 separate portals. All you needed to do, first of all, was to unify them. Because many of the mistakes that used to happen is the manual entry of data that didn't go from one to the other. And then when you manually entered it, the people running the second portal had to go and verify from the people of the first portal whether correct data had been uploaded. Completely simple thing. All we did was use APIs to get these things to become seamless. Just talk to each other. So it became one portal, one process. Didn't have. Now why? Remember I told you, don't take an old process and simply lay on digitization. It'll actually make it more complicated. The old process before digitization was actually simpler, but at least the same file would move up. Here you took a file, got everything, uploaded it, pulled it out again. This was what was going on. So first thing, unify all those. Just by doing it, I managed to and did some other simplification. So wherever you had sequential processes, I made them parallel. Basically, we took 25 down to 14 just by doing this. And then we simplified a few things else. Removed the manual parts. 4 steps went down. Various things happened parallelly. So all these kinds of solutions happened. Here is what happened as a result of this change. Look at it. So we were doing something like 900 odd approvals a month till August of last year. We introduced this system in end September of 25, and look at how it begins to go up. In October, it jumps up to 3,600 cases, approvals, jumps then to 7,500, jumps further to 11,400, and the last month of data that we have is for March. It goes up to 14,500 cases in 1 month by just simplifying this process. So much so that we are now getting rid of the backlog. And in the next few months, we will actually have cleared up the backlog entirely. And in fact, this number will go down because we are not getting so many cases coming at the same speed. So we are actually waiting for you. So if your grand aunt did give you a lot of money and you hadn't been able to get it back, this is your time in the sun. Same data in a slightly different way. That was the number of approvals. This is by number of shares transferred. And you can see what was going on till last April, September. And now October to March, we are doing a multiple of the number of shares transferred. Same data, just by number of shares. So, hopefully by now you have been convinced about how process reforms are done, how to think about problem solving, identifying the blockages, making the changes, and trying to get that system to work. Now, one of the things is that as a result of now having done literally hundreds of these changes, there are some things that I have learned about process reforms and about the art of making rules themselves. See, you have to know one important thing about the world, which is that the world is intrinsically unpredictable. If you hang around long enough, something will happen that you could not have predicted. You've seen it in the last few years. There was no way in January 2020 I could have predicted that the next 2 years would be impacted by some virus called COVID-19 emanating from Wuhan, China, that was going to upturn our entire lives. Completely unpredictable thing. In the last few months, we have had a war in Iran. Before that, we had a tariff issue, and so on and so forth. The world is continuously being buffeted by shocks. So sitting here, the world can go into multiple different pathways, and so it is impossible to judge where it will go. Why is this an important insight? It is an insight because it leads to the Nobel Prize winning research of somebody called Oliver Hart. Oliver Hart made something called the incomplete contract theory. So basically what he said, that it is not possible to create a contract between two people, and by the way this includes laws and regulations, because that's a contract between the state and the citizen. So there is no such thing as a law or a contract that is complete, that can take care of every possible future outcome that can happen. If you attempted to create a law that was able to deal with every possible future outcome, that law would be infinitely long and would very quickly become impossible to use, which leads to something called the 99-1 problem. The 99-1 problem is this, that if you keep a law or running or a regulation running for a while, and you keep adjusting the laws in order to accommodate exceptions, exemptions, misuse and so on, you will end up after a while where 99% of the laws are dealing with 1% of the exceptions, exemptions and the misuses. So 99% of the people who are perfectly normal people will be forced to comply with this huge gamut of laws which are actually doesn't apply to them at all. And yet they have to apply for it because of that 1%. What is the insight here? That when you create laws, it is best not to attempt to be comprehensive. Make the laws simple. If it deals with 99% of the situation, then, or 99.1 if you prefer, whatever you think is a reasonable cutoff, keep the laws to deal with those situations that are normally going to happen. For the exceptions, exemptions and the cases of non-compliance, what you should do is to allow other systems to deal with it, not the law. So this is where you have, for example, if it's something criminal or misuse is happening, let the courts deal with it. If there is an exceptional situation where you need to deal with an exception, then let the ombudsman deal with it. Do not ask the law to deal with it, because if you create eternally complex laws, what will happen is that these laws will become so complicated, is a euphemism that bureaucracies use for making very complicated laws that they claim can take care of every situation. Gold standard law is a simple law. It's not a law that takes care of everything. So, what are the things we should do? And what are the different kinds of new kinds of reforms that I am now advocating? So far I've talked about reforms that I have already managed to do, and I only gave you examples of things that I have personally worked on. But of course, there are many other reformers in the system who are doing other reforms. But I'm now going to talk about a reform that I want to now begin to push for, which is the Transparency of Rules Act. What is this reform? See, one of the things that I have come to believe after having now worked in the government for almost a decade is that in fact one of the big problems with India is not that Indians are somehow natural lawbreakers. That is what everybody thinks it is. The real problem in India is not that we are somehow lawless. After all, when we go to another country, we behave perfectly well. Even our driving improves. So what is it that causes us to feel lawless in the country? The reason is a very simple one, that in fact most citizens of India do not know what the rules, regulations and laws are. That is the fundamental reason. And why don't we know what the laws are? Because in fact it is extremely difficult to find out what the rules are. because it's not in one place. I'm quite certain if I ask you to tell me exactly what the fine is for maybe driving on the wrong side of the road in Chennai or in Tamil Nadu generally, you will not be able to tell me by Googling it up. Just try. You will not be able to know, is the cop supposed to take your license or not? Nowhere it's written. How much money is he supposed to charge you for doing this? What is the procedure? Not written anywhere. This is where a lot of the rent-seeking harassment happens. Similarly, in many other aspects, you will discover that you do not know what the rule is. You think you have followed the rule. When you actually turn up in dealing with the government, you will be told, sorry, you have not filled form J1 and complied with rule 78 subsection D. Now, how do I know where the section D is? What is it? So this is a major problem that you have. And yet, the entire basis of all legal systems, including India, is that an ignorance of the law is not a defense. Right? So you cannot say, sorry, I didn't know what the law is. The citizen is supposed to know. But my argument against this is, yes, I will know the law, but I should have a fighting chance of finding out what it is. How do I find out what it is? Impossible to know. So, I am arguing for something called the Transparency of Rules Act, which will say the following, that effectively what this law will do is, first of all laws, rules, regulations, forms and other citizen-facing requirements shall be easily acceptable in a dedicated centralized portal and on the websites of the relevant department or agency. They have to put it up. If they have not put it up, that rule or regulation, it will be deemed not to apply. And if they put something wrong down, then that law will apply till they have changed it. So for example, if the Transport Ministry by mistake writes that in order to get a driving license, I have to learn Bharatnatyam, and I have learned Bharatnatyam, then you have to give me my license. It's your problem to tell me what the law is. And it's only when you change the rule, then you can ask me to learn how to drive a car. Otherwise, Bharatnatyam. Similarly, the website where these laws and rules will be changed will have to be time stamped. Why is this important? Because then retrospectively rules cannot be changed. I will know that at 9 o'clock on July 25th, 2026, this rule applied to me. At 10 o'clock, the rule was changed. But at 9 o'clock, I did something that violates that 10 o'clock rule. I cannot be held responsible. There was no way for me to know what the future rule would be. So therefore, it has to be time stamped. And the third, and very important, is that these rules have to be presented to me as a citizen in one form, not as a series of circulars. How am I to know which circular is the latest one? How do I know? So if I go to the website, I should be able to do this. Now, this is not a complicated thing to do. Go and look at Wikipedia. Wikipedia tells you what the rules are. It also allows you to go and look at the history. But it doesn't ask me to look through the entire history to figure out what the current position is. So the current position should be told to me clearly, and as I said, it is time stamped, so you can't change it suddenly. I can go back and look at what the past law was as well. And in this way, we will remove a very major source of uncertainty in how our governance is done, a major source of harassment, and a major source of rent seeking. This is a very important reform that we need to do. I have been advocating it, and I hope I've convinced people in this audience that this is a law that needs to be backed. I'll give you an example of something we have already done in these directions, something called the RBI's Master Circulars. Till 2025, the RBI used to have something like, I don't know, something more than 9,000 circulars. Many of them contradicted themselves. So you deal with FEMA and all that, you will know this. So there were 9,000 plus such circulars, some of them dating back to 1944. Nobody knew which of these applied and which of them didn't because you hadn't scrapped them. This led to, as you can imagine, confusion, harassment and many other things. Now, as of November 28-25, the RBI announced a final issuance of 244 master circulars, of which basically the 9,446 circulars that you used to deal with, 3,809 have now been subsumed into these master circulars. So all those laws are now exist, and as a result 5,673 have been repealed as obsolete. So as a citizen, you now know that those 3,809 are the ones you're supposed to follow, and those are now nicely and neatly given to you in the form of 244 master directions. Clearly tells you, supposing you're dealing with banking, then go here. If you're dealing with foreign exchange, go there, and so on and so forth. And once a year or thereabouts, they are going to carry on. Now, one point I want to make. They did not change any rules here. It's the same rules. All they have done is gotten rid of the garbage, told you what the rules are, and presented to you in a clear format. It's as is. And the result of this is dramatically lowering all the unnecessary harassment, conflict, confusion that used to be there. So this is an example of the transparency of rules that I have been advocating. So here are some conclusions before I stop, and maybe you can do some Q&A. The process reforms, as I said, are an important part of policy and governing toolkit. Most of the time, they require small targeted iterative changes. I'm saying this because everybody loves to have these big, grand reforms. Those are disruptive, they're difficult to do, but the point is, they're mostly not needed. Once in a while you need them. Yes, you couldn't have gone from the old tax system to the GST system without one big leap. So sometimes you do need structural reforms, but most of the time actually you need to do small iterative changes. They're less disruptive. Supposing a mistake happens, they're easy to unwind and do again, and so on and so forth. Second, we need academia here. I'm in an academic institution. I need you to help me document the large numbers of reforms that happen, because if we do not document it in a nice academic way, we cannot teach it. The business changes and re-engineering that happen tend to be made into nice case studies that are taught in management schools. This is hugely beneficial to those who want to become managers. Unfortunately, the same thing is not done in public administration at all. So those who are studying public administration or economics, it is very unlikely that you will be taught how to do a reform. You'll basically turn up somewhere. If you become a public administration person, you'll certainly turn up and be asked to make reforms, and you will have no idea how to do it because nobody has documented these changes. So please, academia, please help me make changes. Maybe even the chartered accountants and businessmen here, those who have capabilities, please write down where the changes, what changes happened, did it help, what happened as a result. And then very importantly, teach it to the next generation. They shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel the way I had to do it. So that basically brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.